Good morning, everyone. We are in Perek Tet of Nechemia, Pasuk Chav Tet. The time had gotten away from me last week, so I apologize. We didn't finish the Perek. So let's just turn back. And if you recall, Nechemia has gathered the people together. And when he gathered them together, he was really reviewing history and how they unfortunately had, as we would say in modern terms, gone off the derech. And part of this plea is to build up to God forgiving the Jewish people, because despite all of the terrible things they kept on doing, God kept on forgiving them. And Nechemia obviously is going to use this as a way of saying, well, you forgave us in the past, please forgive us in the present. So in Pasuk Chavtet, just to pick up where we were, Vatad bahem lahashivam elu toratecha, and the Nevi'im warned the Jews to return back to the Torah. The Ralbag says this is actually in the time of the Malachim themselves. This is really referring to the period of Yeravam, and afterwards, after the split of the north and the south. Vehema hezidu v'lo sham'u l'mitzvotecha v'mishpatecha chatuvam. And unfortunately, they didn't listen to the Nevi'im, and they continued to sin. That a person might just do and continue to live in this approach. And they gave a rebellious shoulder, which is very simply like you can imagine. Mitzudat David says it's just like a person who turns his back on you. That they just turned around, and that's the way it's talking about it. Interestingly, this idea of soreret is a lot stronger. This rebelliousness, and their neck became stiffened or strengthened, and they didn't listen. We talked about this last week, the idea of an am kshei oref, of a stiff-necked people, in this case a strong-necked people, as people who are unwilling to veer from their direction. They just see ahead, and they're not willing to move one way or the other. You imagine a person, with a stiff neck trying to cross the street. It is not a very simple process. You only look one way, you don't look around. And I mentioned last week as well, the Chatam Sofer, one of his famous statements on Chumash, where he says, Am Kshei Oref. This is talking about the fact that the Jews were never willing to learn from the past. They couldn't turn around and see what was behind them. And so this is also, all of these ideas, there's a sense of stubbornness. V'timshoch alehem shanim rabot, and nevertheless, you, as Rashi says, continue to have rachmanas on them for many years. Vatadbam beruchacha biyad v'yecha v'lo yizinu, and you continue to try to convince them, to warn them. The ta'ad is hatra'ah, is a warning via the Nevi'im. They didn't listen. And ultimately, what you did was you gave them over to the Amaratzot, to the nations there. According to the Malbim, this is talking about initially the idea of the Galut Aseret HaShvatim, the 10 tribes, and ultimately the Galut Bavel itself. And through your great mercy, you didn't destroy them. If you remember, there's this famous question of Soloveitchik has this piece about why is it that on Tisha B'Av, the afternoon of Tisha B'Av, the morning of Tisha B'Av is lessened, whereas we know historically in the afternoon of Tisha B'Av is actually when the Beit HaMikdash was being destroyed. The destruction was actually in the afternoon, where Soloveitchik talks about, and this is based on a midrash, that at that point, when the Beit HaMikdash was being destroyed, we actually saw God's rachmanos, because he was destroying the eitz ve'even, he was destroying the buildings, and he wasn't destroying the people. So the very fact that he sent them into Galut, punished them via Galut, it could also be an element of rachamim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because he didn't destroy them. Ki kel chanun rachumata, because you are a God of mercy and grace. You, God, and this is that phrase that we have adopted within our tefillot. If you remember, going too far with praise of God is actually diminishing. There's a certain formula. If I go ahead, and the example I may have given here, but I know I've given in other classes as well. One of the nicest and strangest comments I get after shul sometimes is when someone goes over and says, Rabbi, that was a really good drasha. Okay, because that may have been a really good drasha, but what about the other 75 I've given over the course of the years? I mean, that wasn't. Okay, so sometimes when you compliment, you also have to be careful about what the compliments imply. If you go too far in those compliments, you're diminishing. Hakela Gadola Gibor Vanara is a phrase that was used and that we can continue to use. Shomer habrit v'chesed al yimat lefanecha et kol hatzla asher matzatnu limlachenu l'sarenu l'chonenu l'vneienu l'avotenu l'chol hamecha mimei malchei Ashur ad hayom hazeh. And we ask God not to forget all of those things, all of the troubles we've had, all of these years. V'atat tzadik al kol habalenu. You are right. You know, that's the first thing when you have to apologize to someone. You know, the worst forms of apologies are those that start with, if you feel that okay, or I didn't want to do this, but if that's your impression, right? Here we just say straight out, God, you're right. Ki emet asita v'anachnu hirshanu. What you did was truthful, and we're the ones who are evil. Vet melachenu, sarenu, kohanenu, v'avotenu. And again, the same group of people, the kings, the officers, the kohanim, and the forefathers, lo asu toratecha. They didn't observe your Torah. V'lo ikshivu al mitzvotecha, and they didn't pay attention to your mitzvot, ula edotecha, and to those various forms of commands which give witness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's power, asher he'edota bahem, which you have given witness through them. Vehem b'malchutam tuvcha harav asher natata lahem uva'aretz harchava v'hashmena asher natata lifnem lo avaducha. And they in their reign, they do. No, I didn't. Okay, no problem. Vehem b'malchutam, and they, okay, our forefathers, when they were the Melachim, when they were kings of Tuvcha Harav, and through the goodness that you had granted to them, and through the great land Vashmina, and the fruitful land and which you gave before them, Lo Avatucha. Amazingly, they didn't serve you. And they didn't return from their rebelliousness, the evil ways of going against you. This is the punchline. And so as a result, Nechemia then says, we are your servants. We are your faithful servants. Okay. We are going ahead and taking care of this. And the land that you've given us, you've given to our forefathers to eat from its fruit and of its goodness. We are servants on it. The Malbim says, we now want to change the trajectory that has been going on throughout Jewish history. We want to be faithful to you. And we want to go ahead and all of the goodness that you've given to the that we have to give to the kings who are taking from us their tributes. We're talking about the Persian the kings. We understand that's because of our sins that this is happening. And regarding ourselves, the Viotenu, our own bodies, we have a labor tax that's placed upon us. We understand, we will do what we need to do, and we therefore are in great trouble. So what happens at the end of this parak, what happens at the end of this parak is very simple. Nechemia lays out, Ezra Nechemia lay out the fact that we've been wrong. This is vidui. We've been wrong. And they go through all Jewish history. We've been wrong then, we were wrong then, we were wrong then, we were wrong then. Each time you tried to help us, We now get it. We want to do better. Okay, we understand that Tsaros we're back in Eretz Yisrael. But despite the fact that we're back in Eretz Yisrael, we're not free people. We have to provide tribute to the Persian kings. We are ultimately provide labor taxes to them. We need your help. That's the bottom line of this parak. And from this parak, what happens is we're ready to move into the next parak, parak Yud, which according to most Meforshim follows parak Tet. Some suggest that this next parak is actually a later occurrence. Okay, not everyone does. We're going to follow the approach that this is the follow-up. Yeah, Mira.
Where did they talk about the people themselves?
Lamed Bet, let me give Lamed Dalet. We're on Sadiq, Lamed Dalet, but Malchimus or Kohanim wrote in a law to Techa. This is the leadership, right?
Right, but what about the people?
So there's a presumption, and we'll see this actually in the Amanah. These are representative leaders, so they're the representatives of the people themselves who haven't followed. Even the people who should have known, the leadership who should have known didn't follow. They moved away, and from when they're moving away, everyone follows with them. Okay, now we're and I know this end of this parak I went a little quicker than normal because I want to get into Parak Yud and complete Parak Yud today. Parak Yud is a seminal parak in Jewish history. Some have even suggested, Rav Steinsaltz among them in his book, Biblical Images in English, Dmuyot, but Dmuyot Tanakh, I think it's called. He has one for men, one for women, but his book, he also talks about the fact this is Parak Yud in many respects is as important in Jewish history as Ma'amad Har Sinai, as the revelation at Sinai. It's different, but it changed Jewish history because this is the moment where there is going to be an amanah. Now, the amanah is a covenant that they're going to enter into, and it's going to be a signed covenant. In some ways, it almost sounds like the Declaration of Independence, the way they had it signed. They had it laid out according to the Malbim, and people literally came and signed it. The leadership had to sign it. There were people who opposed it, but the vast majority of the Jews at the time accepted it. It is a step that's being taken by the Jewish people to go ahead and once again redirect themselves to being in favor of God. Thanks, Joe.
Some Jewish people, I know 25 years have passed, but a Jewish leader comes up and delivers a speech that everyone should do good. All the people.
No, all the people don't follow. No, don't ever think we ever get it all. In other words, we will see, and it's from a careful reading of Parak Yud, where there are people who are not mentioned. There are going to be people who are going to be opposed. Okay, then it sounds like it's Jewish. Yeah. Now, what I did provide for you is a bunch of different things to look at and to read. And what I want to do before we start. Oh, sorry, Yaka, yeah.
Quick question on the context, perhaps the text. Was this a tefillah? Because if I go back and look at Vayomru Halviim in Parak Text Pasuk A, Vayomru Halviim, and so on and so forth. Hu Baruch Hashem Elohechem Min Haolam Ad Olam. V'Baruchu Shem Kodecha Atahu L'Hem L'Vadecha. This is all tefillah.
Well, it starts with a vidui, and then you move into a tefillah. The tchina actually is where it's referred to,
So,
starting from pasuk lamed bet.
okay.
Lamed bet is the plea to God.
Right.
Up
So-
until lamed bet, it's all vidui.
So my question is, if you look at the beginning of Yud, which you're about to start, I don't see a transition.
Right. Now, so the interesting thing, uvechol zot, the question is, and through all of this,
It's not words.
right, so the question is, what is this? So Rashi is going to say, the opening of Parak Yud, Rashi says, is through all of the evil that has come to us, we are now taking the step, and we're going to enter into this covenant. That this is, we look at what was, and now we're making this next step. There are two different ways to look at that, Rashi. It could be despite, but most likely the way I've always understood it is because.
So here's my question, which is, in Hay, it says, Vayomru in going back test, Vayomru Halviim names with the im, and then all this speak. It's as if everybody's saying they passed out the text and everybody said it together. And I don't see anyone spokesman.
So what happens is, first you encounter this first is the gathering. The gathering includes these number of steps that take place, including the Levium and including the brachot that take place and the responsiveness. Then what happened in this parak, and it goes until Pasuk Hey, Then it starts the historical piece where we talk about the creation, we're talking about Avraham Avinu, and then we start going through this whole thing. And at that point, what we're understanding Perek Tet to be is Perek Tet. It is ultimately a combination of efforts and of who's speaking in all of this. That there is this public ceremony taking place around the Beit HaMikdash where the Leviim have their roles and others have their roles. Everyone is jumping into their roles. And then afterwards, we start with this great comments that we start talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that is delivered either by Ezra or by Nechemia or a combination of the two.
Actually say that
Right.
it's been divided out.
Right. That's how it plays out. Now in Perek Yud, I want to take two pieces of the handouts that I handed to you. This one, which has two sides to it, is from Menachem Elon's Mishpat HaIvri. Okay, Menachem Elon, former Supreme Court Justice in Israel, also a big Talmud Chacham. His son, he has a number of sons. One of them, unfortunately, is infamous. The other is famous. Benny Elon is his famous one. The other was the infamous one. Unfortunately, we'll leave him alone for a moment. And in these pieces, just Menachem Elon wants to put certain things in a certain context. So just to understand where the Amanah plays out, if you look on page 265 at the bottom, it says in the underlined piece here, in order to span the chasm, the break, Ezra and Nechemia came and they entered into a new covenant for Torah. And following the break of the people from the laws of Torah, based on the fault of their teachers, the Kohanim, Ezra went ahead and he transferred things. He himself was a Kohen. What he did was he transferred the teaching, and the understanding and the ruling regarding Torah from the role of Kohanim to the people themselves. To those who were the wise people of Torah in every shevet. Of course, among the first group of people, the Sofrim, what we call the Sofrim, were a lot of Kohanim and Leviim. They were the experts at the time. From that point on, the leadership, Torah leadership, went to whoever were the greater Gedolim. We talk about this idea that the Keter Torah is not an inherited right. It was, up until the time of this Amanah. Up until the time of this Amanah, the Kohanim and the Leviim had pretty much the power itself. And what Ezra did is really the beginning of what we'll call Mishpat Ivri. Okay, of the beginning of what we'll refer to as Jewish law itself. And then just to turn on the second side, which is a little bit later in Mishpat Ivri, where it says HaKnesset HaGdolah in 454, Ezra the Sofer and Nechemia and the people who signed on the covenant, who signed on the covenant to fulfill the laws of Torah. These are the people who were the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah. And we know the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah was a legislative body. There is a machloket how many people were in it. The numbers range from 85 to 120. The Israeli Knesset today has 120 members based on the Medrash that there were 120 members of the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah trying to the revival of the Jewish legislature. The number 85 actually comes from our parak, where there's 84 names listed of people who signed, and a presumption that there was an 85th. One of the presumptions of the 85th may have been Ezra, may have been Shvatcha. There's a number of different theories who the 85th was, and also based on a Yerushalmi that says that there were 85 Chachamim in the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah who approved the establishment of the holiday of Purim. Yavetz, and this is what Rabbi Mishkin taught us many years ago, Yavetz has the opinion, yeah, there were 85, and over the years it grew to 120. And so the initial legislative body was 85 people, it grew to 120 people, and he resolved the two sources. We're just possibly talking of different periods. There are others who disagree. We've talked about the importance, says Menachem Elon, that ultimately brought a qualitative change into the ways of ruling in halakha and in law via the people. Okay, that the Torah people return to a life of Torah, which ultimately caused the need to develop the Jewish law. Medrash filled this in many ways, this role. And alongside and especially when there wasn't within the power of interpretation of texts to resolve issues. Then the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah had the other power, which was to establish either decrees, takanot, things that resolved problems, or gzerot, issues that were able to, decrees that were able to avoid problems. We don't really know. We don't have a clear understanding of the role of the boundaries, the roles of and how it was structured. The Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, we're on the next slide. That was the highest governing body at that time. There's even a machlok how many people were in it. 120. According to one approach, there was 120. 85. Even though we don't have clear understanding of this, precise understanding of this, of the role of the Knesset Hagdolah, barur. One of it is clear, and that was legislative. To go ahead and make these various rabbinic laws. And you see this clearly in Pirkei Avos, where it says, Hem, referring to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, Amru Shlosha Dvarim, said three things: heavy mutzunim bedin, be involved in law. Ve'amidu talmidim harben, establish many students. Vasu siyag l'Torah, and create safeguards for Torah. Hamidu talmidim harben, zoe hachdarat Torah la'am kulo. Establish many students. That's the idea that we want to have Torah taught all through to everyone. Asu siyag l'Torah, elu henagzerot v'takanot. Hakuriyim siyag l'Torah. And when it says make the siyag l'Torah, these are these takanot, etc. Hevim mitunim badin azara veitzach v'chit v'chashuva b'tkufa gdola zo shel yitzira. And also you have to be very careful. You have to be really involved in the law. That's actually a warning that the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, if you misuse your power, it also can fall. So number one, we're walking into this new era of Jewish history. That's what this covenant is going to do. That's part one. Yeah. Good question. Okay. The Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, we're really not sure, because we start talking again about the Sanhedrin, okay, and the rest of the period of the Second Temple. Okay, we also remember, if you remember, even Napoleon wanted to create another Anshe Knesset Hagdolah at the same time, or another Sanhedrin actually wanted to create it, but a model more after an Anshe Knesset Hagdolah of a legislative body. It's during the period of the Second Commonwealth. We don't have, there's even a debate about whether or not this is them or not. But many take that approach. This is the way I was always taught when I was learning Jewish history in yeshiva. We were taught this way. This is the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. The other piece is, and this is from Yavetz, and Yavetz on this sheet, the other double-sided sheet. And for those who are online, I apologize. I didn't bring up the screen, so I will try to pull them up now. The other screen, let me see. No, single-sided. I'm sorry, single-sided. I apologize. If you have, do you have the single-sided? Let me see if I can find it real quickly. Yeah. So on the other one, and let me just, for the people who are online, I'm just going to try to get this working properly so you can see it. Okay, this is from Zev Yavitz. Zev Yavitz, famous historian, not considered one of the great historians today, but was a great historian, not one of the most modern of the historians, but one that we studied a tremendous amount. He was fascinating personality, was in Israel for a little bit, was in the United States, late 1800s, 1900s. Okay. Good question. I don't remember. I have to look that up. I have to look it up. But Zev Yavitz, he's one of ours, okay, and he's he is a brilliant man. Part of the reason that people don't learn him as much nowadays is, again, his historical methods were more traditional. He was in the same time as Shimon Dubnov, in the same time as Heinrich Gretz. Those were the three major historians that we had to deal with at that time. Now, in terms of what he's writing in his piece. So what I just wanted to talk about a moment in terms of Yavitz, and this is just to jump off a little bit into our parak. If you look on page 150, it's on the right side of the page, and you'll see in the text there's a number 6, about it's 6 lines from the bottom, okay? And he starts talking about our parak. Uvechol zot anachnu kortim amana. And despite all this, or with all of this, okay, we are now entering into a covenant. V'divrei amanayu brit alau shvua. And this amana was a covenant, a type of oath that was taking place. Asher hachatumim aleh kiblu al nafsham v'al neshem v'zaram, which the people who signed it accepted on themselves and on their wives and on their offspring, lachzik alehem lalechet b'torat Hashem, to follow the law of Hashem, v'lishmor l'asot et kol mitzvotav u'mishpatav v'chukav, where they're going to follow to do all of his mitzvot and all of his statutes and all of the ordinances, lishmor gamet mikdash Hashem, and also to guard over, to take care of the Beit HaMikdash bichvodo in an honorific way. Lateit shlishita shekel legulgolet l'shana lezevach u'mincha b'nesach, and they're also going to give a third of a shekel. Why a third of a shekel? We'll see that in the text. There's a machloket. The value of a third of a shekel was a different shekel. It was a different weight of a shekel, and so one approach is the third of a shekel is equal to the half shekel that they would give. Another theory of it is it was an additional tax as well. Yavitz is of the approach that it was in place of the half shekel, the third, because it was the same amount of silver that was associated with it. Okay, that would support the offerings and the meal offerings and the libations, ulaviat, bikurei pri artzamvet, bikurei b'emtam, and to bring the first fruits of the firstborn at reshit arisotam, and also challah, the beginning of the dough. Okay, v'et trumatam v'et masrotehem lekohanim v'leviim, and also the truma and also the tithes to the Kohanim and the Leviim, kakatuv b'Torat Moshe, as it's written in the Torah. Ulechalkel gamet korban haitzim b'moado, and also they're going to be providing the wood for the purpose of burning on top of the mizbeach. Leman tikon avodat hakohanim b'Beit Hashem hamerkaz ha'achad l'chol kodshei Yisrael v'lishmor gamet tarat habayit, in order to establish the service of the Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash, that is a singular center for all of the sanctity of the Jewish people, and to guard also the purity of the place. The vilti hitchaten b'mei haaretz ulekadesh et Shabbat, also against intermarriage, and also for the sanctity of Shabbat. The vilti asot bo kol melacha, where in Shabbat you won't do any form of labor, kakatu b'Torah, like it's written in the Torah. Uvilti kenot bo kol kinyan, and also you're not allowed to do commerce, to buy things. Uvilti mechor kol memkar, and you can't sell things. Lishmor et Shabbat et Shabbat haaretz, what? Lishmor et Shabbat haaretz, to keep the Shemitah, ulishmot et masher yadam, and also to the during the Shemitah year where we cancel debts. Lishmor b'shana shvi'ita hi shnat hashmitah. Vayavo ala chatum al amana zot, and those who signed this amana were Nechemia ben Chachiliah. Okay, was Nechemia, v'zignei sarei kohanim, and the elders of the officers of the Kohanim, v'haleviim, roshei hamishmarot, the heads of the various watches, v'roshei avot leveit Yisrael, and the heads of the various families of the Jewish people. Vayehi mispar chatumim arba'ah u'shmonim ish. Okay, there were 84 people who signed it, levad mi Ezra, excluding Ezra. And again, as I mentioned before, there's a number of different approaches of who the 85th was. This is based on a pshitata, actually, that has Ezra in that list. Ach v'hachel shir haLevim bayom hahu tziva Ezra sofer ve'ibadel kahal ha'am mitumat goyei ha'aretz beregesh u'bechozkat hayad b'veit Hashem. And then, when the Levium began their song, Ezra commanded that the people have to separate. V'hakohanim tokim b'shofrot v'halevim mizamrim v'menagnim b'chol kli shir b'kol gadol ma'od la'ot l'zikaron. And the Kohanim are blowing the shofrot, and the Levium are singing and playing with all sorts of musical instruments. It was loud. I guess they had the amps turned up to make this a momentous event. Ki ein lahem chelik v'Yisrael b'rucho v'torato. Vayar v'yomahu mispar hanivdalim, and the number of people who separated them grew. Vayu lekat rabav atzuman. They became a large group. He kata prushim hagdolim. This is the beginning of the Pharisees. We'll see in the text that we talk about people who were nivdalim, who separated. Separated in Mishnaic Hebrew is lifrosh. Okay, we have it also. It's a Hebrew word found in the Torah, but lifrosh, like al tifrosh minat tzibur, for example, talking about in general. But the Perushim, the Pharisees, were starting at this time. Excuse me, I lost one. V'yula kat rabav atzma hi kata prushim agdola v'nichbada v'homedet bemunata ad hayom hazeh. That remains until this very day. We are descendants of the Pharisees. Rabbinic Judaism is Pharisee Judaisum. Ulanashim asher davku b'shrirut libam b'kutim uvamei haaretz v'lo nivdalu b'hem, and those people who continued to intermarry and did not separate, Karula min hayomahu amei haaretz, were referred to amei haaretz, the people of the lands. Uliyachid am haaretz lemor ish hadavak betumat hamamim haktanim v'nivazim shebnei Yehuda v'tzorarea asher hayu lahem korei bnei Yisrael amei haaretzot. And they were then referred to as the people who were the amei haaretz, similar to the amei haaretzot, almost like the non-Jews. Now, the reason I read this piece from Yavitz is not only does he give a good summary of what we're going to encounter, but he also gives us one more historical important note. Not only is this Amanah that we're going to read the beginning of the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, the beginning of the legislator and the transference of Torah, Hemidu Talmidim Harbe, if you remember, of transferring the Torah from just a Kohen Levi power to the power to everyone. It's also the beginning of the split of the Sadducees, the Tzedukim, and the Pharisees, the Prushim. The Tzedukim and the Prushim are going to follow us throughout the Second Commonwealth, the Second Beit HaMikdash. The Tzedukim are the priestly, are a segment of the priestly class who are their leadership. That's because they had the power of Torah. They were the ones who were the keepers of Torah. They were the ones who were the teachers of Torah. Along comes Ezra, and he takes that power away from them. And when he takes that power away from them, the beginning of the tear occurs. You don't find it until later years where the Tzedukim begin to reject Torah Shebal Peh. Why do the Sadducees reject the oral law? Because the oral law is the product of the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah and the Pharisees. And so when they lost their control over Torah, and the control was then passed over to the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, and they democratized, which is the word I keep on using in these shirim, they democratized Torah, those former leaders rejected it. And ultimately that rejection led to this major split. Two of the major groups in the Second Temple, there were many split groups in the Second Temple, but two of the major groups during this Second Temple era were Sadducees and Pharisees. It starts in this parak, in Parak Yud. Yeah.
I'm just based on Yavitz, I'm sorry, but I don't see it, only because he says you have the two groups, the groups that he's defining is those who bought into the Amanah and those who did not.
Right.
But they, and it says.
He doesn't touch the Tzedukim yet. Right. He just talks about the rise of the Pharisees, of the Prushim.
Right.
The rise of the Prushim will give rise to the Tzedukim. If you remember, the initial group.
they split off the Amei Haaretz, which he designates?
No, so they're going to split off from the Prushim. Originally, as we saw also, and that was, I believe that was in the piece from Menachem Elon, the initial leadership of the teachers were Kohanim and Leviim, because they were the most educated.
And the Tzedukim started from the
Kohanim, right, from Tzadok. Was
Right.
one of is the classic answer, even though not everyone agrees with that, but that it's Tzadok HaKohen, okay, that they split. But we'll see that split developing. What's happening now is we have this amorphous whole. The first thing that happens is the establishment of an Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, the democratization of Torah. Now, the Tzedukim initially, or the Kohanim and Leviim are initially in this, and there's protections for Kohanim and Leviim in this. And then you have the Amei Haaretz, the people who are not willing to separate and are still intermarrying. The Amei Haaretzot, we'll see them develop in a different way as well. And then what's going to happen as the years move on, and as more and more of the general population take control of Torah and have that role of Torah, we then see that Tzedukim are going to break off. Okay, and it's not really that they're breaking off from the Prushim, they're breaking off from those who had been faithful to Torah, and they begin to break off, because as the years go on, the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah are going to create more takanot and gzerot, more democratization of things, and they're going to start rejecting it. The only way you can reject parts of them is to reject actually all of them at some point, and that's where the Tzedukim are going to come from. And you're going to find in this, by the end of the second Beit HaMikdash, or by the later years of the second Beit HaMikdash, this battle between Tzedukim and Prushim, we had, Kohanim Gedolim who bought the job, okay, who were completely corrupt, who were in a Sadducee, were Sadducees, completely corrupt, etc. And we have the same thing, if you look that in the New Testament, the Pharisees are the bad guys. Okay, and so we have these names and these terms, but the Prushim start here. So when I mentioned at the beginning that this was really a seminal event in Jewish history, Perek Yud, it sets the stage for who we are today. The idea of the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, to take one example, and I'm not sure we're going to get too much into the text, I'll use a couple more Mekorot though instead, but to give one example, one of the decrees is going to be the decree that's going to govern commerce on Shabbat. Now, you're really allowed, midioraita, to buy and sell things. From a biblical law, you can buy and sell things. The reason we don't do commerce on Shabbat and extend it to such an extent that we won't make a kinyan, we won't have an act of acquisition on Shabbat, is because there was a concern that things were normally recorded and you'd get a receipt. Okay, and so because people were writing, which is prohibited midioraita from the Torah, therefore we said, don't do things that are going to want people to write. And so as a result, midirabanan, we prohibit writing. Where is that midirabanan start? In this perek. They say you can't do that. Now, when you look at this perek and you start talking about what are the things that are happening in this perek, you begin to understand what were the major challenges they faced. For example, let's take one at a time. And Yavitz actually goes through this and the various things they wanted to talk about. The number, they start out, first of all, in terms of the various pieces, was the general observance of Torah. Okay, we see that. We saw that from Perek Tet. They've abandoned. We see within this as well that the idea of supporting the Beit HaMikdash. Why? Well, they have lived for years without a Beit HaMikdash. And the Beit HaMikdash that they initially, that Ezra really put together, was not the grand structure that it should have been. They had lived in Galut, and it was necessary to bring this back together. And remember, for many, many years, since the time of Yeravam and Rechavam, okay, when the north and the southern kingdoms split, there were challenges to the Beit HaMikdash. So they have to look at the Beit HaMikdash, their obligation. The idea of giving bikurim, the idea of giving the challah, the idea of the meiser and the truma, all of those things have to be brought. Now, why meiser and truma? We'll see that part of this piece is going to be that how it's given is going to be given in the Beit HaMikdash, as opposed to Kohanim and Levim running around the country. Because we want to centralize, we want to keep the people who are supposed to be working the Beit HaMikdash there, not feel like if I'm working in the Beit HaMikdash, I'm going to lose out on earnings that I could possibly get, or gifts that I could possibly get being a Kohen if I was out in the country. So there are all of these things. There's also going to be as well Shabbat. Well, Shabbat's always one of the first things that has risks associated with it. And a number of different things. Shemitah, again, now part of the issue of Shemitah is, will Shemitah, in fact, there's a machloket even, if even Maestros and Trimos nowadays, there's a machloket, whether or not after a galut, when only some of the Jews came back, are all of these things obligatory? And so all of these things had started falling into disuse or abuse along the way. All of that is going to be happening in this point. Now, at the very same time, if you look at the Gemara that I gave you, and again, we'll get into the text of this next week, but I guess we'll do it on this one. The Gemara sheet that I gave you, which is this one. Okay, it's this one. Okay, it's a Gemara Bava Kama, and it talks about the Takanot of Ezra. Okay, what were the decrees that Ezra put forth? And this is, remember, talking about the time of the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah. Asara takanot tiken Ezra shekorim b'mincha b'Shabbat v'korim b'Sheni v'Chamishi. One is Ezra made sure that there were regular Torah readings, right? That mincha time on Shabbos we read the Torah, that Mondays and Thursdays we read the Torah. Why? Because of the fact that we wanted to make sure 3 days would never pass without the Jews having learned some Torah. There were public readings. There's a later Gemara which questions this, that maybe this was an earlier format, but what we ultimately say is the format that we have of at least 10 psukim with 3 aliyot, that was Ezra's Takana. The Danin b'Sheni v'Chamishi, and also that every city had an obligation of a Beit Din, and the Beit Din met on Mondays and Thursdays. Why Mondays and Thursdays? Mondays and Thursdays were transformed into, because of the public reading of the Torah, major gathering days. They became market days. They also became days of court. Many of us will remember that in the olden days, stores were open till 9 o'clock on Mondays and Thursdays. That was still a holdover from this idea of market days. Nowadays, it's not like that. I tell my students about stores being open later on Mondays and Thursdays, and they look at me like I'm crazy. Okay, because yeah, but it used to be Mondays and Thursdays, the same principle. So Ezra and Nechemia, what they did, Ezra said, you got to read on those days. He continued. So we know that Torah was a major focus, right? Torah was a major focus, and din, and the idea that batei dinim, and that halacha. So think about, again, what's he trying to accomplish by these takanot? He's trying to address problems, litaken, to solve things. That's the idea of a takana, right? Versus a gzera, which is more trying to change certain things. Litaken is to solve a problem. Gzera is generally trying to avoid a problem. Okay, but to go, and it continues on. And he also said, by the way, that you have to have clean clothes on Shabbos, and so you do your laundry on Thursdays. And also they felt that garlic was an aphrodisiac, and that you'd have that on Shabbat, Erev Shabbat. And that a woman should get up early and do her baking before Shabbat. Why? This was actually, as the Gemara will explain, not so much just for Shabbat, because there were women who would provide food for others, and you wanted to make sure that that food was going to be available. There was a communal responsibility around the Shabbat as well. And also that a woman would have to dress. This is an element of tznius. It was like knickers that a woman, or not knickers, underwear, kind of underwear women would wear under their dresses. There was an element of tznius, and also how she would prepare specifically for the mikvah. And also the perfumers, the people who would sell perfumes, would be permitted to travel through the cities. Okay, and also that men would have to go to the mikvah also when they had an emission. Now, these pieces, if you look at the categories of things that are going on, Ezra made these 10 things, talks about family, right? We're talking about family, the relations, it's talking about Shabbat, and it's talking about Torah. Those three aspects were what he was trying to resolve. And by doing it in the way he did it, he changed the nature of a Jewish community. And if you go one last thing, and just look here on this page, okay, this is the last page I'm going to deal with. I handed out 4 of them, so we're going to look at 4 of them. And let me see if I can find this one for everybody here. This is a Gemara in Shabbos. Now, the Gemara in Shabbos, this is Peichet. Everyone knows this page on Shabbos is where it talks about the whole revelation at Sinai, all the Midrashim, Vayityatzvu b'tachtit hahar, the Jewish people stood at the base of the mountain. Amar Rav Avdimi bar Chama bar Chasa, Rav Avdimi said, Melamed shekaf HaKadosh Baruch Hu alehem et hahar kigigit. God lifted the mountain over them like a gag, like a rooftop over them. And God said to them, listen, I got this great option for you. Accept the Torah, everything's going to be good. If you don't accept the Torah, you're going to die. Okay. It's now normally, this is the alternative approach to the Jewish people saying Naseh v'nishma, which was an act of love. This was an act of utter awe and fear. This is a great statement about Torah. Rashi explains, ultimately, this is the announcement that people can say. If someone says, hey, how come you didn't keep Torah? They can say, we really never wanted this. It was like we didn't have much of a choice. So don't blame me too much for it, okay? Nevertheless, Hadur, people went ahead, Chazru, v'kiblu abiyimei Achashverosh. In the time of Achashverosh, we re-accepted Torah, dichtiv kimu v'kiblu hayudim, kimu masha kiblu kvar. It says the Jews accepted what they had already accepted at Sinai. And so this is the Midrash which talks about the fact that there were 2 acceptances of Torah. There was the revelation at Sinai, and then there was the time in Purim, where we re-accept the Torah. Now, Purim remembers the Persian era. Here is we are in the Persian era as well, okay? And says the Chidushei Haran, Rabbeinu Nissim, he writes as follows, Moda'ara bale oraita. There's a good answer. Hikshe HaRamban, the Ramban asks the question, if so, lama na'anshu kodem Achashverosh? If the Jews accepted the Torah under duress at Sinai and only accepted it willingly at the time of Achashverosh, so why should Jews ever have been punished before the time of Achashverosh? And if you're going to say because they rejected what God had told them to do, then what does the Gemara mean when it says we got this great excuse? And why did they have to have this Kabbalah, this acceptance, and also a covenant? And also, don't we have in the Torah right before they entered the land of Israel that there was a covenant, like you find in Sota. And there, in Arvot Moab, in the plains of Moab, no one was forcing him that they would have an excuse. And also in Sefer Yoshua, they were a number of times given warnings about Torah, and they always accepted it on their own, willingly. So the question the Ran asks is very simple. I don't understand the Gemara in Shabbos. I just don't understand the Gemara that says, hey, you accepted Torah under duress, so here's your great excuse. Because if you accepted it under duress and here's your great excuse, then why were we ever punished? We should be able to be exempted. V'yesh lomar, dehem v'adai midaite kiblu Torah al menat she'yanchilam haaretz. That the Jews actually on their own accepted Torah, but there was an understanding there that it was ultimately for the purpose of receiving the land. Okay, let me just do it over here. Okay, that they were going to be able to get the land of Israel. Because as it says, that ultimately they're going to get the land, and that's why they're going to have to keep the Torah. And that's actually the meaning of the Gemara, where it says that if you accept the Torah, great, and if not, you're going to be buried here. When it says you're going to die here, it means you're never going to enter into the land of Israel. You're going to die in the desert. And God, if they didn't accept the Torah, God wouldn't take them in the land of Israel. And therefore, when they violated Torah, God went ahead. What was his punishment? You get the land of Israel because you keep the Torah. You don't keep the Torah, you lose the land of Israel. God exiled them. And then when they were in Galut, they said, hey, we kept the Torah to get the land of Israel. We don't have the land of Israel. We don't have to keep the Torah anymore. And therefore, and they said to Yechezkel, hey, a master sells off his slave. What obligation does a slave have for the master? God sent us into Galut. He gave us away. Why do we have an obligation to God? Lefichach, and therefore, kishabau la'aretz biyashniya. And therefore, when they came now the second time to the land of Israel, b'yamei Ezra, in the time of Ezra, amdu me'atzmam v'kiblua below shum tanai. Therefore, they accept Torah without any conditions. V'shelo yit'anu od shum tarumat v'hainu b'mei Achashverosh hotziam mimavet l'chaim v'yad zeh chaviv lahem migula shel Mitzrayim. And that's talking about the time of Achashverosh when they were saved from death at the hands of Haman, and this is even more beloved to them than Mitzrayim. In other words, what the Ran teaches us is he gives us one more reasoning behind the Amanah, the power of the Amanah. So far, we talked about this Amanah being the beginning of a new legislative process, the beginning of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. And we talked about the Amanah being a new commitment to Torah of Hibadlu or Nivdalim, the Prushim are starting. He says this new obligation of Torah is an obligation of Torah that is independent of the land of Israel. That until the time that they came back, there was always this understanding of Torah being dependent on our having the land of Israel. In a sense, this Amanah, as strange as it is, while it is given at the point when the Jews return to the land of Israel, is the covenant that guarantees the observance of Torah even when you're outside the land of Israel. It is an acceptance of Torah without any other condition. It's not because we're going to get the land, it's because we want to keep Torah. And so all of these pieces together point out this importance of this document that's going to be signed and that we're going to learn about next week, because now our time is up and I'm not going to start the parak except for the first two words which Jaffa asked me about. Or 3 words. And next week, we're going to do Perek Yud. We've had all the introductions I can imagine giving, and we'll stop right here.
Excellent.